This is the story of Australia's deadliest cave diving disaster, a tragedy that changed underwater exploration forever. But to understand how 8 experts became trapped in an underwater maze, we need to go back to where it all began, with a farmer, a horse, and a hole that seemed to have no bottom. In 1938, in one of the most isolated corners of Australia, Adelaide, the state capital, sprawls with over 1 million residents. But travel just a few hundred miles southeast and you'll find Mount Gambier, officially the state's second largest city, yet home to barely 33,000 souls. For thousands of years, water has been dissolving the limestone foundation, creating an invisible network of caverns, crystal blue lakes, and sinkholes that plunge into the unknown. Thompson's paddock was nothing special, just 5 acres of dairy farmland between Mount Gambier and the Southern Ocean. On that ordinary day in 1938, a farmer was working his field, his horses pulling equipment through the tall grass. Then, without warning, one of his horses stumbled violently, nearly throwing the farmer from his seat. What the horse had discovered would haunt the farmer for the rest of his life. Hidden in the grass was a hole, barely a foot wide, but as he peered into it, he could see water glinting in the darkness about 20 feet below. This wasn't just a simple hole. As the farmer's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized the narrow opening was deceiving. Underground, it widened dramatically like a funnel turned upside down. Anyone who fell through that opening would plummet 20 feet to the water, then find themselves trapped in an underwater chamber with no way to climb back out. Terrified by this death trap on his property, the farmer made a decision that would become legendary in the region. He began throwing rocks into the hole, not small pebbles, but soccer ball-sized stones that required both hands to lift. The first dozen rocks disappeared with loud splashes, then dozens more. The farmer enlisted his neighbors, and they hauled hundreds of rocks to the opening. As weeks turned to months, hundreds became thousands. Every single rock vanished into the dark water below without a trace. By the time they gave up, they had dumped enough rocks to fill a small quarry. Yet when they peered down into the hole, the water remained crystal clear and empty. Word of the bottomless pit spread throughout the region. Scientists eventually identified it as a limestone sinkhole, carved by centuries of slowly dissolving rock. But it wasn't until the mid-1960s, nearly 30 years later, that anyone dared to discover what lay beneath those dark waters. When that first diver was lowered into the abyss in the mid-1960s, he expected to find a simple underwater cave. What he discovered instead was a hidden wonder that would draw explorers from around the world. 23 feet below the surface, he found himself floating in what can only be described as an underwater cathedral. The chamber was massive, 56 feet wide at the water's surface, with limestone walls that disappeared into the darkness below and above. Sunlight would pierce through the narrow opening above, creating a brilliant sapphire beam that illuminated the crystal clear water like something from another world. The locals began calling it the shaft, named for this ethereal shaft of light that seemed to connect the underwater realm to the heavens above. As divers explored further, they made an incredible discovery. Remember those thousands of rocks the farmer had thrown into the hole decades earlier? They found them, all of them, piled into a small mountain at the bottom of an enormous underwater chamber. But the rock pile wasn't touching the actual floor of the cave. It was suspended in the water, still 50 feet above the true bottom. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of rocks, dropped over months, had formed just a tiny hill in what was clearly a massive underwater space. The cave wasn't just big, it was colossal. When the shaft was finally mapped years later, the dimensions were staggering. The main chamber stretched 460 feet long and 260 feet wide, larger than a football field, hidden completely underground. But that was just the beginning. From this central chamber, 2 tunnels branched out like the arms of some massive underground octopus. The first tunnel descended northwest to 260 feet deep. The second plunged southeast to an incredible 407 feet deeper than a 30-story building is tall. Geologists believed these tunnels might connect to underground rivers that flowed all the way to the Southern Ocean, creating a vast hidden network beneath the Australian landscape. The shaft became legendary among cave divers. Crystal clear water that offered visibility for hundreds of feet. Dramatic limestone formations, overhangs and restrictions that created an underwater obstacle course. And always, the haunting beauty of that sapphire beam of light, calling divers deeper into the unknown. By 1973, the shaft had attracted over 8,000 dives. Divers came from across Australia and beyond to explore its depths. Despite all those dives, no accurate map of the cave system existed. The tunnels twisted and branched in ways that defied easy exploration. The true depths remained unknown. To the diving community, the shaft was an ultimate challenge, an endless abyss that tested the limits of human exploration. And that reputation is exactly what attracted 9 dive instructors to attempt what they hoped would be a record-breaking dive of May 1973. May 26th, 1973. 9 dive instructors arrived in Mount Gambier. They set up camp near the famous Blue Crater Lake. They were planning to dive deeper than anyone had gone before in the shaft. Every single member of this team was a certified dive instructor, the elite of the diving world, in 1973. There was Robert, John, Peter, Gordon, Larry, Joan, and 3 siblings, Glenn, Stephen, and Christine. Christine was the only woman on the team. Their goal was ambitious beyond measure. Reach the perimeter at 250 feet deep, the edge where sunlight from above finally fades to complete darkness, where the cave floor disappears into an abyss so deep that no one had ever seen the bottom. These expert divers were about to make decisions that today would be considered suicidal, not because they were reckless, but because the safety knowledge we take for granted simply didn't exist in 1973. They planned to dive to 250 feet, breathing regular air. Today, every certified diver knows that's a death sentence. Modern safety protocols limit regular air to just 130 feet. Beyond that depth, nitrogen narcosis begins to impair your judgment and motor function. You literally become drunk underwater. But it gets worse. At 185 feet, regular air becomes toxic. The nitrogen doesn't just impair you, it can cause convulsive seizures. Imagine having a seizure 200 feet underwater. Your mouthpiece falls out, your body goes rigid, and you drown in seconds. On May 27, they conducted what seemed like a perfect practice dive. They descended to the rock pile, set up a weighted guideline for their record attempt, and explored the upper reaches of the shaft. Everything went smoothly. The cave was crystal clear. The shaft of sunlight illuminated their path. They returned to town that evening, recharged their air cylinders, replaced batteries in their flashlights, and made final preparations. May 28th, 1973. The sun was shining directly through the shaft's opening, creating that famous sapphire beam that had guided thousands of divers before them. Joan made a last-minute decision not to dive but remain on the surface to help with equipment. That left 8 divers: Robert, John, Peter, Gordon, Larry, Glenn, Stephen, and Christine. One by one, they were lowered into the shaft using the famous tripod hoist system. The opening was still too narrow for divers to enter wearing their equipment tanks. Weights and gear had to be lowered separately. It was a complex operation that required perfect coordination. At 12:30 p.m., all 8 divers were in the water, 23 feet below ground level, floating on the surface of that underwater cathedral. Above them, the narrow shaft of light created an otherworldly glow. Below them, the crystal clear water revealed the rock pile 130 feet down, and beyond that, the mysterious darkness that had never been fully explored. They began their descent, swimming down along the weighted line they had set up the day before. The water was so clear they could see for hundreds of feet in every direction. Everything was going according to plan. At 180 feet deep, Robert felt it first, that unmistakable foggy feeling that every deep diver dreads. Nitrogen narcosis was setting in earlier and stronger than usual. His judgment was becoming impaired. His motor skills were starting to deteriorate. He signaled to the others that he was heading back up. 7 divers watched him swim away toward the rock pile above, then continued their descent toward the legendary perimeter. The remaining 7 were now at the deepest point any of them had ever explored in the shaft. Glenn was swimming close to his sister Christine, taking pictures in the ethereal blue glow. Glenn began feeling the effects of nitrogen narcosis creeping in. More importantly, when he checked his air gauge, he realized he was getting dangerously low. Since all the divers had started with the same amount of air, he knew the others must be running low too. He turned to signal Christine that it was time to head up. He reached out to tap her shoulder, but she kicked away from him, swimming further into the cave toward the darkness beyond. Glenn faced a split-second decision: chase after his sister and risk both their lives, or trust that she and the others would follow soon. He chose to surface. As Glenn swam upward, clouds moved across the sun above. In seconds, the shaft transformed from a crystal-clear underwater cathedral into a dark, disorienting maze. That famous sapphire beam of light, the beacon that had guided thousands of divers safely to the surface, simply vanished. Peter, still at depth and severely impaired by nitrogen narcosis, tried to follow what he thought were other divers heading for the exit. But in the sudden darkness, he became completely disoriented. The clear limestone walls that had been visible moments before disappeared into blackness. He had no idea which direction led to safety. Meanwhile, Christine, Gordon, and Larry found themselves at the deepest point any of them had explored, over 200 feet down, in the section of cave that had never been properly mapped. As they realized their air supplies were critically low, panic set in. Instead of swimming diagonally along the cave ceiling toward the distant exit, they looked up and swam straight upward. In limestone caves like the shaft, gas bubbles from divers' exhaled air can collect in dome-shaped pockets in the ceiling. Over time, these gas pockets create a mirror-like surface that reflects light exactly like the surface of a lake. To divers impaired by nitrogen narcosis, these false ceilings look identical to the cave entrance. Christine and Gordon's flashlights reflected off this deadly mirror, and in their panicked state, they were convinced they were swimming toward the surface in safety. Instead, they slammed into solid rock. They were trapped in an underwater pocket, frantically waving their lights, terrified and running out of air. Above them was nothing but limestone ceiling. Below them, the cave floor had disappeared into darkness. They were suspended in an underwater nightmare with no way out. Larry was with them when disaster struck, but at the critical moment, his flashlight suddenly went out, plunging him into complete darkness. In that moment of terror, he drifted down just far enough to escape the deadly illusion. When his light flickered back on, he could see another diver in the distance, and beyond that, the real exit, impossibly far away. Larry bolted through the water like a man possessed, his lungs burning, his air gauge reading empty. He burst through the surface, gasping and choking. Peter, despite being completely lost in the sudden darkness, managed to escape the growing silt cloud that was now obscuring the cave, and he too found his way to the surface. As Glenn, Robert, Larry, and Peter treaded water 23 feet below ground level, staring up at the narrow shaft of light above them, the horrible truth became clear. 4 divers were still down there: Christine, Gordon, Stephen, and John. Glenn, realizing his brother and sister were trapped below, made a decision that nearly cost him his life. He grabbed a spare air tank and dove back down into the dark water, deeper than he had ever gone before. At 225 feet, Glenn found Stephen's flashlight and camera resting on the cave floor, abandoned equipment that told a story of panic and desperation. Beyond that point, the shaft had become a nightmare of silt and zero visibility. Glenn ventured into the murky cloud but immediately became disoriented. Fighting every instinct as a brother and fellow diver, Glenn was forced to retreat. Going further would only add a 5th body to the tragedy. He surfaced knowing that Christine, Stephen, Gordon, and John were somewhere in the darkness below, and that there was nothing anyone could do to save them. By the time emergency services arrived, everyone knew the truth. This wasn't a rescue operation anymore. It was a body recovery. But even that would prove nearly impossible in the depths of the shaft. The news of the disaster spread quickly through the small community of Mount Gambier. 4 experienced dive instructors were trapped somewhere in the depths of the shaft, but even the police divers weren't equipped to reach them. The next day, police divers made their first recovery attempt. They managed to reach 200 feet before being forced to abandon the effort. The cave was still heavily silted from the previous day's tragedy. Visibility was 0, and the depths involved were beyond their training and equipment capabilities. For the families of Christine, Stephen, Gordon, and John, the waiting began. Months passed while authorities arranged for Navy divers to train local recovery teams for the unprecedented depths involved. In January 1974, 8 months after the disaster, a film crew arrived at the shaft. They were producing a documentary about cave diving and wanted to include footage of Australia's most famous underwater cave. On January 22nd, the film crew descended to about 50 feet with professional lighting equipment that illuminated the shaft like daylight. A technician was adjusting equipment when he noticed what looked like a 3rd person behind his 2 teammates. It was Stephen, trapped under a narrow ledge, his buoyancy device inflated, suspended near the ceiling of the cave. The evidence suggested he had tried to find the exit by floating upward and following the ceiling, but had run out of air before reaching safety. In March 1974, experienced recovery divers finally reached the deeper sections of the shaft. At 185 feet, they found Christine and Gordon lying together on the cave floor. The positioning of their bodies suggested they had died in each other's arms. John was found last and deepest at 205 feet, wedged under a rock ledge in a section of cave that led away from the exit. Survivors remembered seeing a diver swimming strongly deeper into the cave, while everyone else was panicking toward the surface. Severely affected by nitrogen narcosis, John had apparently become so disoriented that he swam in the opposite direction from safety, deeper into the abyss until his air ran out. John's body couldn't be recovered until April 1974, nearly a year after the disaster, because of the extreme depth and the way he was wedged under the rock formation. Each recovery operation required specially trained divers using equipment that pushed the limits of what was possible in 1974. The shaft disaster didn't just claim 4 lives, it shattered the entire foundation of cave diving in Australia. The diving community was forced to confront a horrible truth. Their safety protocols were actually death sentences waiting to happen. Within months of the tragedy, the Cave Divers Association of Australia was established with one mission: ensure this never happened again. Guidelines became mandatory for any cave exploration, no exceptions. The maximum depth for regular air was slashed from the insane 250+ feet. These divers attempted to a much safer 130 feet. Beyond that, specialized gas mixtures became required. Cave-specific certification became mandatory. No more open water divers exploring underwater caves. With the benefit of hindsight, the mistakes seem obvious. diving to 250 feet on regular air, exploring uncharted areas without guidelines, having too large a group to manage safely in an emergency. But in 1973, these weren't recognized as fatal errors. They were simply the accepted practices of the time. These weren't reckless amateurs. They were experienced instructors who genuinely believed they were diving safely. They had no way to know that the protocols they trusted were fundamentally flawed. Their deaths weren't the result of stupidity or carelessness. They were the inevitable result of an entire industry that didn't yet understand the true dangers of what they were attempting. Today, the shaft still draws divers from around the world, but they descend with proper training, appropriate gas mixtures, mandatory guidelines, and safety protocols that have reduced cave diving fatalities by over 90% since 1973. The crystal clear waters of the shaft continue to reveal their secrets to properly trained explorers. The same underwater cathedral that claimed 4 lives in 1973 now serves as a training ground where divers learn the safety protocols that emerged from that tragedy. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dive documentaries into the world's most mysterious and dangerous places. And let us know in the comments if you need any story like this to cover. We are happy to do the research and unlocking those stories for you. Until next time, stay curious, but stay safe.